Before we dive into one of the most dangerous and unsung operations of World War II, if you're fascinated by the hidden stories that shaped history, hit that subscribe button and the bell icon so you never miss a moment of these untold chapters. Now let's descend into the cold, murky waters of liberated France, where men risked everything to bring a nation back to life. The summer sun of 1944 hung over the port of Cherbourg, but beneath the surface of the harbor, the water was black as coal and cold enough to numb a man's fingers in minutes. The retreating Wehrmacht had done its work with methodical precision. Before evacuating the city in late June, German engineers had turned the harbor into a graveyard. Every dock, every quay, every mooring point was choked with twisted steel and sunken tonnage. Block ships lay across the channels like fallen giants, their backs broken, their holds flooded, their masts jutting from the water at tortured angles. The harbor that had once welcomed merchantmen and fishing boats now resembled a scrapyard designed by nightmare. And it was not alone. Le Havre, Brest, Saint-Nazaire, Marseille, Toulon, every major French port the Allies needed to sustain their advance into Europe had been systematically destroyed, mined, and blocked. The liberation of France had opened the door to victory, but that door remained useless if the supplies to feed an army could not flow through it. The arithmetic was brutal and simple. Every day the ports remained closed. Thousands of tons of ammunition, fuel, food, and medicine had to be trucked overland from distant beaches or flown in at exorbitant cost. The Red Ball Express, that legendary convoy of trucks racing supplies from Normandy to the front, was bleeding men and machines on roads never meant for such punishment. Eisenhower's staff calculated that a single functioning deep-water port could deliver more material in a week than a month of truck convoys. The block ships had to be cleared. The docks had to reopen. And the only way to do that was to raise the wrecks. That was where the hard-hat divers came in. These were not the glamorous frogmen of special forces, not commandos with knives and limpet minds. These were salvage specialists, trained in the unglamorous, brutal work of underwater construction and demolition. Most were Royal Navy Salvage Service personnel, veterans of operations from Scapa Flow to the Mediterranean, men who had spent years learning to work in darkness and cold, their bodies encased in rubberized canvas suits, and their heads sealed inside brass helmets that weighed 40 pounds before they even hit the water. Others were U.S. Navy salvage divers, Seabees who had cut their teeth in the Pacific, and scattering of civilian contractors pulled from shipyards and docks across Britain and America. They arrived in Cherbourg with portable compressors, lifting pontoons, cutting torches, patch plates, and a grim understanding of what the job would cost. The first dives were reconnaissance. A diver named Mitchell, a Royal Navy petty officer with a Liverpool accent and hands scarred from a decade of underwater welding, was among the first to go down in Cherbourg's outer harbor. The procedure was always the same. He stood on the narrow deck of a salvage barge while two tenders dressed him, pulling the heavy suit over his woolen undergarments, cinching the seals at wrists and ankles, lowering the Mark V helmet over his head, and locking the collar ring with deliberate, practiced turns. The world became muffled, reduced to the hiss of air through the inlet valve and the hollow echo of his own breathing. His lifeline, his umbilical to the surface, snaked behind him, a bundle of air hose and communications wire that a tender would pay out as he descended. He wore lead-soled boots that weighed 20 pounds each and a weight belt slung across his chest. Without them, the buoyancy of the suit would send him rocketing to the surface, a death sentence called an uncontrolled ascent. Mitchell stepped to the ladder and began his descent. The water closed over his helmet, cold and viscous, a world without color. Visibility was perhaps 6 inches on a good day, less when the tide stirred the silt. He could see nothing but the faint blur of his own gloved hand held inches from the faceplate. He descended by feel, counting the rungs, feeling the pressure build in his ears and chest, the suit compressing around him as the tons of water above pressed down. At 40 feet, the ladder ended, and his boots touched bottom. Mud and debris shifted under his weight. He stood still for a moment, letting his breathing settle, listening to the creak and groan of metal somewhere in the darkness. Then he began to walk, one slow step at a time, hands outstretched, the lifeline trailing behind him like a tail. The first wreck he encountered was a merchantman, a French coaster that had been scuttled directly across the main shipping channel. His gloves found the hull, cold and slick with algae, the steel pitted and torn. He followed it upward, feeling the shape of the vessel, mapping it in his mind. A massive hole gaped in the port side, large enough to drive a truck through, the edges jagged where an explosive charge had blown out the plating. He traced the perimeter, judging the size, then tugged the lifeline twice. Topside, a tender wrote down his report as it came through the communication wire, scratchy and distorted but intelligible. Hole in port side, estimated 20 feet by 12. Plating blown outward. Hull resting at 30-degree list. Structure appears stable. Proceeding aft. Mitchell moved along the hull, feeling for other damage, for weak points, for anything that would complicate the salvage. The work was meditative in its tedium, a slow, methodical process of touch and memory. He found a second, smaller breach near the stern, this one caused by the ship settling onto debris on the bottom. He found a tangle of mooring lines wrapped around the propeller shaft, a hazard that would need to be cut away before any lifting could begin. He found a hatch that had been left open, flooding the interior compartments. Each discovery was relayed topside, each detail noted. After 40 minutes, his air supply was running low, and the cold was seeping through the suit, numbing his legs and arms. He signaled for ascent, and the tenders began to haul on the lifeline, pulling him back to the surface. He came up slowly, pausing at intervals to allow the nitrogen in his blood to dissipate, avoiding the bends, that agonizing condition that could cripple or kill a diver who ascended too quickly. When his helmet finally broke the surface, the tenders unscrewed the faceplate, and the world rushed back in, bright and loud, and full of air that tasted like diesel and salt. Mitchell was hauled onto the deck, where he sat shivering while they stripped the suit off him. A mug of hot tea appeared in his hands, laced with rum, and he drank it in silence, staring at the sunken mass that jutted from the water 100 yards away. The plan was straightforward in theory, nightmarish in execution. To raise the merchantman, they had to make it buoyant again. That meant sealing every hole, every breach, every open hatch and damaged plate, so that pumps could force the water out and replace it with air. Only then would the wreck have enough lift to be brought to the surface, or at least raised high enough that cranes and lifting pontoons could move it off the channel and out of the way. But sealing a ship underwater, in zero visibility, with every surface covered in oil and marine growth, was a task that tested the limits of endurance and ingenuity. The patch plates were fabricated topside, sheets of steel cut and shaped to fit the contours of each hole, rimmed with rubber gaskets and fitted with bolts that could be driven through pre-drilled holes in the hull. Mitchell and his team spent days preparing, measuring, cutting, welding, checking and double-checking every dimension. Then came the descent, the same slow journey into the black, but this time carrying tools and materials. A patch plate for the main breach weighed 200 pounds in air, less underwater but still cumbersome, a flat sheet of metal that caught the current and dragged at a diver's strength. Mitchell worked with a partner, another diver named Thompson, a quiet man from Glasgow who had worked as a shipfitter before the war. They descended together, lifelines parallel, and maneuvered the plate into position by touch alone. Aligning the plate in darkness was an exercise in patience and profanity. Mitchell held one edge while Thompson worked the other, feeling for the jagged rim of the hole, adjusting the angle, tapping it with a hammer to settle it against the hull. The current tugged at them, trying to spin the plate away. Silt rose in clouds, reducing visibility to nothing. They communicated by tugs on the lifeline, 1 pull for yes, 2 for no, 3 for trouble. When the plate was finally in position, they began to bolt it down, threading heavy studs through the holes, tightening nuts with wrenches that had been weighted to stay in their hands. Each bolt took minutes. There were 20 bolts to set. Mitchell's arms ached, his breathing came in ragged gasps, and the cold had worked its way through every layer of insulation until he felt it in his bones. But the plate held. He tested it, running his gloved hand along the seal, feeling for gaps. Water still seeped through in places, but the flow was manageable. The pumps could handle it. Topside, the salvage master, a Royal Navy lieutenant commander named Harris, watched the air bubbles breaking on the surface and marked the progress on a chart. Harris was a compact man with a weathered face, and the kind of calm that came from years of managing chaos. He had overseen salvage operations in Scapa Flow after the German fleet scuttled itself in 1919, and he had pulled wrecks off the bottom of Alexandria Harbor after Axis air raids. He understood the rhythm of the work, the way every operation unfolded in small, hard-won increments. Around him, the barge was a hive of controlled activity. Compressors hammered and chugged, feeding air down the hoses. Pumps stood ready, their engines ticking over. A crane, mounted on a flat-bottomed barge anchored nearby, swung its boom in slow arcs, testing the load. French dockworkers, thin and sunburned, moved crates of tools and coils of cable, speaking in rapid patois that Harris barely understood but respected. These men had survived the occupation, had watched their port destroyed, and now they worked alongside the Allies to rebuild it, driven by a fierce, silent pride. When Mitchell and Thompson surfaced, Harris called them over. His voice was level, matter-of-fact. "Good work. Main breach is patched. We start on the stern hole tomorrow. After that, we cofferdam the open hatches and begin pumping. If the pumps hold and the patches don't blow, we can attempt a lift in 3 days. Weather permitting." Mitchell nodded, too tired to speak. 3 days. It sounded like a lifetime. The cofferdam was a different challenge. The open hatch on the forward deck could not be patched from the outside. Instead, they had to build a temporary structure over it, a watertight box that extended above the waterline, sealing the opening and creating a dry space where pumps could work. The cofferdam was fabricated from timber and canvas, reinforced with steel bands, and lowered into place by crane. Mitchell and Thompson guided it down, positioning it over the hatch, while tenders on the surface adjusted the crane's tension. When it settled, they bolted it to the deck, sealing the gaps with oakum and tar, the same materials caulkers had used for centuries. The work took 2 days. Every dive was a gamble. The tide turned twice a day, bringing stronger currents that could sweep a diver off his feet or tangle his lifeline in debris. The wreck itself was unstable, its structure weakened by months underwater, prone to shifting without warning. On the second day, Thompson was working near the bow when a section of railing gave way, crashing down and narrowly missing his helmet. He surfaced white-faced and shaking, and Harris pulled him from rotation for the rest of the day, sending him to sit with the French workers and drink coffee until the tremor left his hands. When the cofferdams were in place and the patches secure, the pumping began. The pumps were diesel-powered monsters, each one capable of moving hundreds of gallons per minute, their exhausts belching black smoke that hung over the harbor in oily clouds. Hoses snaked down into the wreck, feeding into the sealed compartments, forcing the water out through scuppers and vents. The process was agonizingly slow. For every gallon pumped out, more seeped back in through seams and cracks, through places the patches could not reach. The pumps ran day and night, their rhythm a constant background roar that drowned out conversation and made sleep impossible. Harris watched the water level inside the wreck, measured by weighted lines dropped through inspection ports. Inch by inch, foot by foot, the level dropped. The wreck began to stir. On the 3rd day, the bow lifted. It was subtle at first, a shift of a few degrees, barely perceptible except to the men who had been staring at the wreck for days. Then, slowly, ponderously, the entire forward section began to rise, the waterline creeping down the hull, as the trapped air inside provided lift. The crane operator, an American Seabee named Kowalski who had grown up working construction in Pittsburgh, fired up the crane and swung the boom into position, lowering a heavy lifting cable that Mitchell and Thompson attached to pad eyes welded to the hull. The cable took the strain with a groan of metal and the whine of the winch. Kowalski worked the controls with delicate precision, taking up slack, testing the load, feeling for the moment when the crane's power and the wreck's buoyancy would balance. Harris stood beside him, one hand on the rail, eyes fixed on the wreck. "Steady. Don't rush it. Let her come up on her own." The wreck rose. Water cascaded off the deck, pouring from scuppers and hatches, sluicing across the barnacle-covered steel. The mast, which had jutted from the water at a drunken angle, straightened, then broke the surface completely, dripping seaweed and trailing lines of cable. The hull groaned, a deep, resonant sound that carried across the harbor, and for a moment everyone held their breath, waiting to see if the structure would hold or collapse. It held. The wreck hung suspended, half in the water and half out, a grotesque, dripping monument to destruction. Kowalski kept the tension steady, while a tug maneuvered alongside, throwing lines to French workers who scrambled onto the wreck's deck, lashing it to the tug's bollards. Then, slowly, carefully, the tug began to tow, dragging the wreck away from the channel, pulling it toward a section of shallow water, where it could be beached and broken up at leisure. As the wreck moved, a cheer went up from the workers on the barges and docks, a ragged, spontaneous shout that echoed off the shattered warehouses. Mitchell, sitting on the deck of the salvage barge with his suit half off, allowed himself a thin smile. 1 down. Dozens to go. The operation in Cherbourg was replicated across every liberated French port. In Le Havre, U.S. Navy salvage teams worked in tandem with French civilians to clear the entrance to the main basin, where the Germans had sunk a cluster of fishing trawlers directly across the lock gates. The trawlers were smaller than the merchantmen in Cherbourg, but there were more of them, and they had settled into the mud at awkward angles, their hulls intertwined like lovers. Divers worked in shifts, cutting through cables and rigging, blowing holes in bulkheads to speed the flooding process, attaching lifting slings that could be hooked to crane barges. The work was complicated by unexploded ordnance. The retreating Germans had mined the harbor, scattering magnetic and acoustic mines across the approaches, and several of the wrecks themselves had been booby-trapped, fitted with delayed action charges meant to kill salvage crews. Bomb disposal teams, men from the Royal Navy's HMS Vernon, who specialized in rendering safe the most devilish devices the Axis could devise, worked alongside the divers, carefully probing the wrecks for tripwires and detonators, defusing charges with hands that did not shake because they could not afford to. In Brest, the situation was even worse. The city had been under siege for weeks before it fell, and the harbor was a wasteland of shattered concrete and twisted steel. The Germans had blown the dry docks, collapsing the massive gates and flooding the basins. They had sunk blockships across every navigable channel and mined the approaches so thoroughly that the first Allied ships to attempt entry hit mines and added their own wrecks to the tally. The salvage effort in Brest became a grinding, months-long campaign, with divers working in conditions so hazardous that casualties were routine. A diver named Edwards, a Canadian volunteer who had worked as a logger in British Columbia before the war, was killed when a section of hull he was cutting through collapsed, pinning him against the bottom. His lifeline was severed, and he drowned before the tenders could pull him free. His body was recovered 2 days later, still encased in the suit, and buried in a temporary cemetery overlooking the harbor. The work continued without pause. Saint-Nazaire, site of the famous commando raid in 1942, presented its own unique challenges. The port's massive dry dock, capable of servicing battleships, had been destroyed in the raid, but the surrounding basins were still choked with scuttled vessels. The salvage teams faced not only the usual hazards of darkness and cold, but also the psychological weight of working in a place where so many men had died in violence. The French workers spoke in hushed tones about the ghosts of the commandos, about the nights when the water seemed to glow with a faint, phosphorescent light, and the sound of footsteps echoed on the empty quays. The divers, pragmatic to the core, ignored the stories and focused on the work, but even they admitted that descending into the water in Saint-Nazaire felt different, heavier, as if the place itself remembered. In the Mediterranean, the ports of Marseille and Toulon were cleared in a massive effort involving American, British, and French forces working side by side. Toulon had been the base of the French fleet before the war, and when the Germans moved to seize the ships in 1942, the French crews scuttled them, sending battleships, cruisers, and destroyers to the bottom rather than let them fall into enemy hands. The harbor was a labyrinth of wrecks, some lying on their sides, others upright, but gutted by fire and explosion. The salvage work in Toulon was as much archaeology as engineering, with divers carefully mapping each wreck, identifying what could be raised and what had to be demolished in place. The French were determined to reclaim their fleet, even if only as scrap, and they worked with a ferocity that impressed even the battle-hardened British and American crews. A French diver named Moreau, a reserve naval officer who had spent the occupation years hiding in the countryside, led many of the dives personally, descending into the wrecks of ships he had served on, navigating by memory through compartments he had once known by heart. When he surfaced after his first dive on the battleship Strasbourg, his face was streaked with tears, and he spoke to no one for the rest of the day. The technical challenges were immense, but they were matched by the sheer physical brutality of the work. Diving in a Mark V helmet was exhausting under the best conditions, and these were far from the best. The water was cold, rarely above 50 degrees Fahrenheit, and the suits provided only minimal insulation. Divers routinely worked until they could no longer feel their extremities, until hypothermia set in, and their movements became sluggish and uncoordinated. The pressure at depth caused nitrogen narcosis, a condition that slowed thinking and impaired judgment, making even simple tasks difficult. Decompression sickness, the bends, was a constant threat. Divers who ascended too quickly or stayed down too long risked agonizing joint pain, paralysis, or death. The recompression chambers brought in to treat cases of the bends were crude by later standards, steel cylinders where stricken divers were sealed and subjected to high pressure for hours while medics monitored their condition. Some recovered. Others did not. The logistics of the operation were staggering. Every port clearance required hundreds of tons of equipment: compressors, pumps, cables, chains, pontoons, cutting torches, welding rigs, and the endless stream of consumables that modern warfare demanded. The equipment had to be transported across a shattered Europe, over roads cratered by bombs and bridges blown by retreating armies. Fuel was scarce, parts were scarcer, and improvisation became a way of life. A CB mechanic in Le Havre, a man named Rodriguez, who had been a garage owner in Texas before the war, kept a crane running for 3 weeks using parts scavenged from a wrecked German half-track, a French tractor, and a British lorry that had hit a mine. When a compressor broke down in Cherbourg, Mitchell and Harris jury-rigged a replacement using 2 smaller compressors linked in series, a setup that should not have worked but did, feeding enough air to keep the divers operating until a proper replacement arrived. The human cost was measured not just in lives lost, but in the grinding attrition of exhaustion and strain. Divers developed chronic ear infections from repeated pressure changes. Their hands became permanently stiff from the cold, fingers swollen and cracked. Tenders suffered from constant exposure, standing for hours on open decks in rain and wind, managing lifelines with hands that bled from rope burns. The French workers, many of whom were half-starved from years of occupation, pushed themselves to the edge of collapse, driven by a desperate need to see their country rebuilt. Harris, watching them, felt a respect that bordered on awe. These men and women had survived the unimaginable, had endured occupation and deprivation, and now they were willing to work themselves to death for the chance to be free again. The strategic impact of the port clearance operations cannot be overstated. By the end of 1944, Cherbourg was handling thousands of tons of cargo per day, a lifeline that fed the Allied armies driving across France and into Germany. Le Havre, Brest, and the other ports followed, each one adding to the torrent of supplies that kept the offensive moving. The divers and salvage crews received little recognition at the time. Theirs was not the kind of work that made headlines or earned medals. But generals and logisticians knew the truth. Without the ports, the advance would have stalled. Without the divers, the ports would have remained closed. In the calculus of war, the men who descended into the cold, black water to patch holes and lift wrecks were as essential as the soldiers who stormed the beaches and the pilots who fought in the skies above. Mitchell dived in Cherbourg until the port was cleared, then moved to Le Havre, then to Brest. By the time the war in Europe ended, he had spent more hours underwater than he could count, had sealed more holes and raised more wrecks than he cared to remember. His hands shook when he tried to hold a cup, and he had lost hearing in his left ear from repeated barotrauma. He was 29 years old and felt 60. When he finally returned to England in the summer of 1945, he was met by his wife, whom he had not seen in 2 years, and his daughter, who did not recognize him. He tried to explain what he had done, where he had been, but the words would not come. How could he describe the weight of the helmet, the darkness of the water, the cold that never left his bones? How could he make her understand what it meant to work in a place where every breath was a calculated risk, where every moment could be the last? He could not, so he did not try. He went back to work as a dock laborer, lost himself in the routine of loading and unloading ships, and tried not to think about the wrecks. Thompson, his partner from Cherbourg, was not so fortunate. He had been diagnosed with chronic decompression sickness after the war, a consequence of too many dives and too many ascents that had been rushed because the work demanded it. The nitrogen bubbles in his blood had done permanent damage, leaving him with joint pain that never eased and a heart that struggled with every beat. He lived another 10 years, working odd jobs when he could, spending long stretches in veterans' hospitals when he could not. He died in 1955, and his obituary in the Glasgow Herald mentioned his wartime service in a single line. The details of what he had done, the risks he had taken, the lives he had saved by keeping the ports open, were not recorded. They did not seem important enough to mention. Harris continued in salvage work after war, overseeing operations in ports across the Mediterranean and the Far East. He became something of a legend in the tight-knit community of salvage specialists, a man who could look at a wreck and know instinctively how to raise it, who could manage a crew through the worst conditions and bring them home alive. He retired in 1960, settled in a small village on the coast of Cornwall, and spent his remaining years building model ships and walking the cliffs. He never spoke about the war, never attended reunions, or gave interviews. When he died in 1978, his family found boxes of photographs in his attic, images of rusted wrecks and hard-faced men in diving suits, of harbors filled with debris and cranes lifting twisted steel from the water. They donated the photographs to the Imperial War Museum, where they remain in the archives, a silent testament to a chapter of the war that few remember. The ports themselves bear no plaques commemorating the divers and salvage crews. Cherbourg, Le Havre, Brest, Saint-Nazaire, Marseille, Toulon, all were rebuilt and modernized, their scars erased by new construction and new commerce. The wrecks were cut up and hauled away, their steel recycled into peacetime goods. The quays where Mitchell and Thompson stood, where Harris directed operations and French workers labored to rebuild their nation, are now lined with container ships and tourists, places of prosperity and calm. The water is clear now, no longer stained with oil and silt, and the divers who descend into it carry bright lights and modern equipment, exploring for sport what their predecessors navigated by touch and courage. The darkness has been banished, the cold made bearable, the risks minimized. But the memory of what was endured, the price that was paid to open those ports and keep an army fed, remains in the archives and the fading recollections of the few who were there. The story of the divers who patched holes in sunken ships is not one of glory or heroism in the traditional sense. It is a story of grinding, relentless work, of men who faced death not in a single, dramatic moment, but in 1,000 small, incremental risks. It is a story of cold water and darkness, of hands that bled and lungs that burned, of decisions made under pressure both literal and figurative. It is a story of logistics and engineering, of the unglamorous, essential labor that makes victory possible. And it is a story that reminds us that wars are not won only by the courage of soldiers in battle, but by the determination of those who work behind the lines, in the water and the mud, in the places where cameras do not go and medals are not given, to rebuild what has been destroyed, and to open the pathways that allow a nation to march forward. The Allied advance into Germany, the liberation of the camps, the final collapse of the Third Reich, all of it depended on supplies flowing through the ports of France. And those ports, in turn, depended on men like Mitchell and Thompson, Harris and Moreau, and the thousands of divers, tenders, crane operators, and workers whose names have been forgotten, but whose labor ensured that the armies could move and the war could be won. Their legacy is not carved in stone or celebrated in speeches. It is written in the cargo manifests of ships that docked in Cherbourg and Le Havre, in the fuel that powered tanks across the Rhine, in the ammunition that broke the Siegfried Line. It is a legacy of sweat and cold and fear, of work done because it had to be done, of lives spent in service of a cause larger than any one person, and is a legacy that deserves to be remembered. If this story moved you, if it opened your eyes to a corner of history that deserves more light, then do me a favor. Subscribe to this channel, share this video with someone who loves history as much as you do, and leave a comment telling me what other untold stories you want to hear. These men worked in silence and shadow, but their story does not have to stay there. Let's bring it into the light together. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.